At his wedding, my stepson walked right past me, gave his biological dad the father-son dance, thanked him in his speech, and didn't recognize me once. Not even a glance. I sat through it all, remaining silent. But after the cake and the guests departed, he walked over and handed me the invoice. I surveyed it, then smiled and exited without saying anything. I, 52M, never thought I'd be writing this, but here we are. 23 years. That's how long I raised that boy. From age 5, when his mother and I got together, through scraped knees and homework battles, high school graduation, college applications, and everything in between. I was the one who taught him to drive, helped him with his first job interview, and walked him through his first heartbreak. His biological father? He showed up maybe 6 times a year if we were lucky. Birthday cards that came late, if at all. Promises to take him fishing that never happened. Child support payments that arrived sporadically, always accompanied by excuses about tough times or new priorities. But last Saturday, sitting in that church pew, watching my stepson get married, none of that seemed to matter to anyone but me. The ceremony was beautiful. I'll give them that. The bride looked stunning, the flowers were perfect, and the venue was exactly what they'd dreamed of. I knew because I'd helped pay for most of it. The deposit for the church, the catering down payment, the photographer's retainer. When his mother passed 3 years ago from cancer, I became his primary support system. Or so I thought. I watched him walk down the aisle with his bride, beaming with happiness. My chest swelled with pride despite everything. This was the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd helped shape. But that warm feeling quickly turned cold as the ceremony progressed. During the processional, he walked right past my row without even a glance in my direction. I told myself it was nerves, that he was focused on his bride. But when the time came for family photos, the photographer called for immediate family only. His biological father stepped forward without hesitation. I remained seated, waiting for someone to notice the oversight. No one did. The reception hit differently. I sat at table 8, not the family table where I'd expected to be. Instead, I watched from a distance as his biological father held court at table 1, regaling everyone with stories about his son. Stories that weren't even accurate, but nobody seemed to care about the truth. Then came the father-son dance. I watched as my stepson walked across the dance floor, past dozens of guests, past me, and extended his hand to his biological father. The man who'd missed Christmas mornings, soccer games, and science fair projects got the honor of that moment. The DJ announced it as a dance between father and son, and the crowd awed appropriately. I sat there with my hands folded, watching them sway to some song I didn't recognize. The biological father whispered something in his ear that made him laugh. For a split second, I wondered what it would have felt like to be the one sharing that moment. Then I pushed the thought away. This wasn't about me. The speeches came after dinner. His new father-in-law spoke about gaining a son. His best man shared college stories. Then my stepson took the microphone. He thanked his beautiful bride and her family for welcoming him. He thanked his college friends for making the trip. He thanked his biological father for being his role model and hero, for showing him what it meant to be a man. The crowd erupted in applause. I waited. Surely there would be some acknowledgement, some small mention of the man who'd actually been there through it all. But as he continued his speech, thanking the wedding party, the vendors, even the bartenders, it became clear that wasn't happening. He wrapped up by saying he was grateful for everyone who had shaped him into the man he was today. He looked directly at his biological father when he said it. Not once did his eyes find mine in the crowd. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. I watched couples dance, listened to toasts, and made small talk with distant relatives who remembered me from previous family gatherings. Several people asked me how I was holding up without his mother, and I gave them the standard answers about taking things one day at a time. Around 10 o'clock, the crowd began to thin. The older guests were heading home, and the younger crowd was transitioning to the hotel after party. I figured this was my cue to leave as well. I'd done my duty, shown up, smiled for photos, and kept my mouth shut about the obvious snub. I was gathering my coat when he approached me. For a moment, my heart lifted. Maybe he'd realized his oversight. Maybe there would be some acknowledgement of our relationship, some small gesture of appreciation. Instead, he handed me a folded piece of paper. He explained, matter-of-factly, that this was the breakdown of wedding expenses and my portion of what was owed. He said his biological father had covered his share, and now it was time for me to settle up. I unfolded the invoice. The numbers were staggering. Venue rental, catering, flowers, photography, music, decorations. It was all there in neat columns with my name at the top. The total at the bottom made my stomach drop. It was more than I made in 6 months. But it wasn't the money that got to me. It was the casual way he'd handed it over, like I was a vendor waiting to be paid rather than the man who'd raised him. Like our relationship could be reduced to a financial transaction. I looked at the paper for a long moment, then at him. He was checking his phone, probably reading congratulations messages or coordinating the afterparty. He wasn't even paying attention to my reaction. That's when something clicked. All those years of putting him first, of sacrificing my own wants and needs for his benefit, of being the reliable presence while his biological father got to be the fun weekend dad, none of it had meant anything to him. I was just the guy who paid the bills. I folded the invoice back up and slipped it into my pocket. Then I smiled at him and told him congratulations again. He thanked me absently and said he hoped I'd had a good time. I assured him I had, shook his hand, and walked away. The drive home was quiet. I kept thinking about that invoice in my pocket, about the numbers and what they represented. Not just money, but 23 years of investment in someone who saw me as nothing more than a bank account. By the time I got home, I'd made my decision. Update 1. The next morning, I did something I'd never done before. I called in sick to work, not because I was physically ill, but because I needed time to think and plan. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and spread out all the financial records I could find related to my stepson. The numbers were staggering. Over the years, I'd kept meticulous records of everything. Call it an accountant's habit. School supplies, clothes, sports equipment, summer camps, music lessons, family vacations, car insurance, college tuition, textbooks, spending money, graduation gifts, apartment deposits, and yes, wedding expenses. The grand total was over $180,000. That wasn't counting the intangibles, the time off work for school events, the late nights helping with projects, the weekend trips to visit colleges, the countless hours of emotional support through various teenage crises. I spent the morning calculating interest, adjusting for inflation, and creating a comprehensive breakdown of every penny I'd invested in his future. If he wanted to treat our relationship as a business transaction, then I'd treat it like one. But I didn't stop there. I also began documenting his biological father's contributions over the years. This was easy because they were so infrequent and minimal. Birthday gifts that averaged maybe $50. The occasional dinner when he was in town. Child support that was supposed to be $400 monthly, but rarely materialized on time or in full. By noon, I had 2 documents, one showing my contributions and one showing his biological father's. The contrast was stark. Then I got creative. I researched what it would cost to hire someone to provide all the services I'd provided over the years. Tutoring rates for homework help, coaching fees for the sports I'd taught him, therapy costs for all the times I'd talked him through problems, transportation costs for all the driving I'd done. I also looked up childcare rates, because that's essentially what I'd been providing for 13 years before he turned 18. Full-time childcare, meals, housing, emotional support, educational guidance, everything a parent provides. By evening, I had a comprehensive business proposal. If he wanted to treat me like a service provider, then he should pay service provider rates. Update 2. I spent Tuesday crafting the perfect response. Not angry or emotional, but professional and detailed. I formatted it like the business proposal it was, complete with executive summary, detailed breakdowns, and payment terms. The document opened with a thank you for his wedding invoice and an explanation that I'd taken the time to review my own records. I noted that while I appreciated his breakdown of wedding costs, I discovered some discrepancies in our accounts that needed to be addressed. I then presented my invoice. 23 years of services rendered, totaling $247,892.33 after adjusting for inflation and market rates. This included childcare services, $87,000, educational support and tutoring, $45,000, transportation services, $23,000, emotional counseling and life coaching, $38,000, housing and meals, $41,000, emergency services and on-call availability, $13,892.33. I provided detailed explanations for each category, including the methodology for calculating rates and the total hours invested. I was particularly proud of the emergency services section, which covered all those middle-of-the-night calls when he needed rides, help with problems, or just someone to talk to. The document concluded with a payment schedule. Since he'd requested immediate payment for wedding expenses, I noted that my services invoice was also due immediately. However, I was willing to work out a payment plan given the substantial amount owed. I included a smaller section about his biological father's account, showing that his contributions totaled approximately $8,400 over 23 years, most of which came in the form of sporadic child support payments. This worked out to roughly $30 per month for the privilege of being called Dad and receiving credit for raising a successful young man. Wednesday morning, I printed the document on professional letterhead, put it in a crisp envelope, and mailed it to his apartment. I also sent a copy via email with a read receipt requested, just to ensure he received it promptly. Then I waited. Update 3. The response came Friday evening. My phone rang while I was making dinner, and his name appeared on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called 3 more times before leaving a message. His tone was different from the casual dismissal I'd received at the wedding. He sounded confused, maybe a little panicked. He said he'd received my letter and didn't understand what I was trying to prove. He asked if this was some kind of joke and said we needed to talk. I didn't call back. Saturday brought a text message asking if I was okay and if something was wrong. He said people were asking where I was because I'd missed his thank you dinner with close family. I hadn't known there was a thank you dinner, which proved my point perfectly. Sunday, he showed up at my house. I watched through the window as he paced on my front porch, clearly agitated. He knocked several times, tried calling my phone while standing outside, and eventually sat on the porch steps. He stayed for almost an hour. I could have opened the door. Part of me wanted to, but I remembered sitting in that church pew, watching him walk past me like I didn't exist. I remembered the casual way he'd handed me that invoice, like I was just another vendor to be paid. Monday brought an email. A long, rambling message about how he was sorry if he'd hurt my feelings, but didn't understand why I was being so dramatic. He said the wedding was stressful and maybe he hadn't handled things perfectly, but that didn't justify my ridiculous invoice. He pointed out that he'd never asked me to be his father figure, that I'd chosen to take on that role when I married his mother. He said I couldn't expect payment for things I'd done voluntarily, and that trying to charge him for 23 years of services was petty and vindictive. The email concluded with an ultimatum. He wanted me to apologize for my stunt and pay my portion of the wedding expenses within 30 days, or he'd consider our relationship over. I read the email twice, then deleted it. Update 4. 2 weeks passed quietly. I went to work, came home, and lived my life without the constant undercurrent of obligation I'd carried for so long. It was surprisingly peaceful. Then his biological father called me. The conversation was awkward from the start. He'd apparently heard about our dispute and wanted to mediate. He suggested we all sit down and work things out like adults. He said family was important and that we shouldn't let money come between us. I found his sudden concern for family values amusing, considering his track record. I told him politely that I appreciated his offer, but that this was between my stepson and me. He pressed the issue, saying that as the boy's real father, he felt responsible for helping resolve the situation. That's when I made my position clear. I explained that if he wanted to take responsibility as the real father, then he was welcome to handle all future financial obligations as well. I mentioned that my invoice was still outstanding and that perhaps, as the real father, he'd like to settle both accounts. The line went quiet for a long moment. Then he said he thought I was being unreasonable and that everyone knew step-parents shouldn't expect the same recognition as biological parents. He said I should be grateful for the opportunity to have been part of the boy's life, not demanding payment for it. I thanked him for his perspective and hung up. Update 5. A month after the wedding, I received a certified letter from a law firm. My stepson was threatening legal action if I didn't pay the wedding expenses and stop harassing him with fraudulent invoices. I called my own attorney that same day. My lawyer reviewed all my documentation and was genuinely impressed with my record keeping. She explained that while my stepson couldn't legally force me to pay for his wedding, I also couldn't collect on my services invoice since there had been no formal agreement. But she had an interesting suggestion. Since he was threatening legal action, why not let him pursue it? If he wanted to take me to court over unpaid wedding expenses, I could countersue for the full amount of my 23-year investment, claiming breach of implied contract and emotional distress. She pointed out that his public acknowledgement of his biological father as his real dad, while treating me as a mere financial contributor, could be seen as fraudulent misrepresentation of our relationship. A good attorney could argue that I'd been led to believe I was investing in a father-son relationship when I was actually just being used as a bank account. The legal fees would be substantial for both sides, and the outcome was uncertain. But if he wanted to play hardball, we could play hardball. I authorized her to respond to his attorney with our own letter, laying out our position and making it clear that any legal action on his part would result in a significant countersuit. His lawyer's response came within a week. They were withdrawing their threat of legal action and suggesting we resolve this matter privately. Update 6. 3 months have passed since the wedding. I've heard through mutual acquaintances that my stepson and his wife are struggling financially. Apparently, they'd counted on family contributions to cover the wedding costs and are now dealing with significant debt. His biological father, unsurprisingly, hasn't stepped up to help with the financial shortfall. The man who got all the credit is nowhere to be found now that there are bills to pay. I also learned that several family members have started asking questions about why I wasn't recognized at the wedding. His mother's sister called me directly to express her disgust at how I'd been treated. She'd noticed the snub but assumed there must be some family drama she wasn't aware of. When I explained what had happened, she was furious. She told me she'd called my stepson to express her disappointment and had made it clear that his mother would have been ashamed of his behavior. Other family members have reached out as well. People who remembered all the times I'd been there for him, all the events I'd attended, all the support I'd provided. They're starting to piece together the real story, and the narrative is shifting. Last week, I received a card in the mail, not from my stepson, but from his bride's mother. She thanked me for everything I'd done to help with the wedding and apologized for any oversight in the seating arrangements or recognition. She said she'd only recently learned about my role in his life and wanted to express her gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than she probably realized. Final update. Yesterday, exactly 4 months after the wedding, my stepson showed up at my house again. This time, I opened the door. He looked tired and older somehow. The confident groom from 4 months ago had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely humbled by recent events. He asked if we could talk, and I invited him in. We sat in my living room, the same room where we'd spent countless hours over the years working on homework, watching movies, and talking about life. He started by saying he'd been thinking about everything that had happened and realized he'd made some mistakes. He said the wedding planning had been stressful, and he'd gotten caught up in trying to manage everyone's expectations and feelings. I listened without interrupting as he explained his perspective, how his biological father had insisted on being involved in the wedding, how there had been pressure to include him in significant moments, how difficult it had been to navigate competing loyalties. He said he'd never meant to hurt me or diminish what I'd meant to him growing up. He acknowledged that I'd been the one who was actually there, who'd provided stability and support when his biological father was absent. But then he said something that revealed he still didn't fully understand the situation. He asked if we could just put this all behind us and go back to how things were before. He said he missed our relationship and wanted me to be part of his life going forward. I looked at this young man I'd raised, who'd just spent 10 minutes explaining how he'd learned to value my contributions, and realized he was asking me to go back to being the reliable safety net while his biological father remained the celebrated hero. I told him I appreciated his apology and was glad he'd recognized his mistakes. But I also explained that some things couldn't be unchanged just by wishing them different. The wedding had shown me exactly where I stood in his life, and that wasn't a position I was willing to accept anymore. I explained that I'd spent 23 years being the responsible parent while his biological father got to be the fun, beloved figure. I'd accepted that dynamic when he was a child because it served his best interests. But now that he was an adult, I wasn't willing to continue being taken for granted. He asked what he could do to fix things, and I told him the truth. Nothing. Some relationships don't survive certain revelations, and this was one of them. He left quietly, and I haven't heard from him since. People ask me if I regret my response, if I think I was too harsh. But I sleep better now than I have in years. I'm no longer waiting for acknowledgement that will never come or investing in a relationship that was never mutual. The invoice he handed me that night was for $15,000. I never paid it, and I never will. But more importantly, I'm never again going to invest my time, energy, or resources in someone who sees me as nothing more than a convenient ATM. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's simply refusing to play the game anymore.